Aethera is a Magitech meets Dieselpunk setting that roughly approximates the technology and political climate of the early 20th century if World War I had been fought between two nearby planets with what amounts to flying battleships, lasted for a century, and involved bioengineered super soldiers, self-aware robots, and wizards. It was my first professional design project and is to this day probably the coolest setting I've ever worked in. Squeezing all of these sci-fi staples into the traditional sword and sorcery Pathfinder rule set was a pretty big undertaking, and our team of 28 developers, many of us very new to the industry, ran into a lot of challenges with siloing and dependencies along the way. I was responsible for designing the new firearm, medical, and cybernetic systems, and a bunch of the new Pathfinder class archetypes, including several for the Gunslinger class that I'm discussing today. Aethera heavily utilizes the Pathfinder archetype system to build mechanically unique classes that reinforce the themes of the setting. Archetypes allow players to step easily into a familiar class, but allow for customization by removing one or more of the class abilities and replacing them with new ones. This system helps both give the players more options for customization so that every wizard doesn't play exactly like every other wizard, and gives designers more room to fit traditional classes into their settings, which is exactly what we needed for Aethera. This keeps the game very accessible for players who are already familiar with the base Pathfinder or 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons rule sets. Pathfinder gunslingers are already a substantial flex from the core rules. In the standard setting, knowing how to use a firearm, or even knowing what one is a rarity, so starting with firearm proficiency and a gun of your own is a significant advantage. Aethera is set at a tech level roughly equivalent to the interwar period in the 20th century, and thus guns are quite commonplace in the setting and require no special training to use. In order to represent this, we use the Guns Everywhere rule to change all firearms from exotic proficiencies to simple weapons for pistols and rifles, and martial weapon proficiency for heavy weapons like machine guns, grenade launchers, and the like. In order to keep Gunslinger feeling like it has a significant advantage in its specialization when firearms are so accessible, we removed the gunsmithing ability that it normally receives at character creation that would give them the ability to make guns and ammo and a gun of their own. We bumped up the gun training ability from starting at level 5 to level 1 and scaling up at every 4 levels thereafter. Firearms don't typically grant a stat to damage, and having the Gunslinger add +3 or 4 to their damage when an attack with a firearm normally deals between 1 and 10 damage for a first level character, as well as avoiding the misfire chance that is present on many weapons in the setting, helps the Gunslinger still feel like a firearm specialist even though everybody has access to guns. Car chases, dogfights, and aerial ship-to-ship combat were very important for capturing the feel of the Aethera setting, and a ship weapon specialist felt perfect for capturing that fantasy. I wanted something that could fulfill the fantasy of Han Solo manning the quad laser turrets on the Millennium Falcon, Max blowing up the canyon walls to dump rocks on the pursuing raiders in Fury Road, and Judge Dredd shooting the tires out of a fleeing Ganger vehicle. These abilities also needed to be available for both players and enemies, so balanced such that they would be fun and flashy for players and generate cool tense moments when used by the villains without being overpowering. Pathfinder already has several existing effects that make it harder for a target to move around. Entangled, exhausted, grappled, paralyzed, and the like, but these are all built around the idea that the target of the effect is a person rather than a machine, and so didn't quite fit the verbiage that we needed. Later editions of D&D and Pathfinder both lead with very generic condition terms, like restrained or immobilized, that help to solve this disconnect, but for this project I forewent keyworded conditions and applied custom debuffs for slowing and disabling enemy ships in the component targeting deed that Artillerists gain access to at level 7. One significant difficulty on this project was that the Aethership rules were being developed at the same time that I was working on the Artillerist archetype, so I did not have them to sync up with while I was determining what effects I could inflict on an Aethership, or what the rules for chase sequences or dogfights would look like. This led to a need for additional development time after my initial design in order to sync the Artillerist abilities with the final Aethership mechanics, as you can see here. While the response to the Artillerists from players who have regular ship battles or chase scenes was very positive, these abilities are more often utilized for NPCs that are purpose-built for occupying such scenes, and so they're much more popular as enemies in the Game Master's arsenal. The analog, low-tech air-to-air or space-to-space battles of Aethera with these giant, sluggish flying boats with boarding parties leaping between them were the perfect place to fit in the classic, pulp sci-fi goodness of the Rocketeer. Personal flight devices have captured the human imagination all the way back to Icarus, and the jetpack wraps the concept up in an awesome sci-fi shell that is always a crowd pleaser. The heart of the Jump Trooper archetype is the Aether Thruster Automata that they gain at first level, a cybernetic implant that allows the character to fly. Granting an item to a player as a class ability is uncommon, but it's one that's already standard with the Gunslinger base class prior to our adjustments for the setting, and we scaled the baseline thruster with the player's Gunslinger level and made it unaffected by abilities that would normally disable equipment, making it feel much more like an ability that scaled with you over time rather than a piece of gear. The biggest hurdle here was that the class is intended to be Gunslinger, and Guy with Jetpack doesn't really fit that fantasy. So during development, this shifted, moving the Aether thruster from a standard backpack-style design to the thrust being generated in the palm of the hand, similar to an Iron Man suit. Allowing these thrusters to then be used as weapons and explicitly giving them compatibility with any firearm-specific bonuses that the player might have helped to bring the archetype back to the central theme. This also reined in a significant advantage that the original design had over the base class. My initial design allowed the players to attack while flying and made them effectively immune to melee attack by non-flying enemies. Pathfinder has contingencies for handling this sort of tactic, but it assumes that players will not have access to those tactics until they're higher level. Adversaries that would be appropriately scaled for a low-level party would not be able to engage effectively with a flying player character at all. We mitigated the situation by requiring the character to have both hands free in order to use the thrusters until they're higher level, allowing the player to fly to a good vantage point to attack from, but always being theoretically reachable by a melee combatant. The thruster attack uses the same energy pool that the flight ability does, and it deals fairly low damage initially, so we scale up the Jump Trooper's energy pool as well as the damage dealt by the thrusters as they level up. We wanted to ensure that the player still has a reason to use standard firearms, as acquiring new gear is a significant part of the enjoyment in an RPG. Keeping the damage and range scaling fairly low encourages the player to have another weapon as their primary, and keep the thrusters as an emergency sidearm or a knockback tool in case an enemy presents a nice dramatic "this is Sparta" opportunity. Managing this energy pool is expected to be a major part of playing a Jump Trooper. I wanted to give them a flashy aspirational ability, so at 19th level, where most games are wrapping up, we give the thrust blasters an infinite ammo cheat code. We save it for the very end of the game so that the player has something to look forward to, but it doesn't cause the gameplay to get stale by taking away the resource management aspect too early. The awesomeness of the Jump Trooper is let down a little bit by how ubiquitous the fly spell is in Dungeons & Dragons and its derivatives. This archetype really only adds verticality to the battleground 4 levels earlier than a wizard would, but player response to the theme and the mechanical benefit of getting access to such a defining ability earlier and more often than a traditional spellcaster was very positive. In any science fiction setting, you will usually have 2 types of gunfighters: little quick ones that are hard to hit, and big chonkin' ones that are hard to hurt. The Siege Walker is the latter. Intended to fill the role of a big tanky firing platform, the Siege Walker gives us a place to showcase both the Okanta, large-framed, animal-headed people who favor big weapons, and the new heavy firearm rules that I developed for this setting. In order to distinguish man-portable weapons from those intended to be mounted on vehicles and gun emplacements, the very heaviest firearms have the stabilized property that makes them work very poorly when fired without a proper setup, normally relegating them to what would be a turret sequence in a video game. From the first level, the Siege Walker ignores this penalty, giving players a way to utilize the big machine guns and cannons the setting offers in a personal capacity. One of the more significant difficulties that we inherited from the firearm rules of Pathfinder is that guns always target the touch armor class of an enemy, an abstraction that takes into account how hard it is to hit something that's very dodgy, but ignores things that are just tough, like a suit of plate armor. Given how prevalent firearms are in this setting, that rule significantly devalues heavy armor, which is a primary part of the fantasy of the Siege Walker. To compensate, I gave them the Bulletproof deed at level 1, which allows them to spend points from a limited pool to use their full armor bonus against a firearm attack. This was a huge boost to the survivability of the archetype and helped to reinforce the playstyle that I had intended, but given that both the deed and the massive firepower ability that allows them to ignore penalties when firing heavy weapons are both available at level 1, this made a single level multi-class dip in Siege Walker extremely desirable for any martial class. My favorite part of this project is that it takes place in a time of huge technological advancement and both technological and cultural mingling for the peoples involved. The humans of Akasat learned to exploit Aetherite and develop spaceflight just in time to meet up with a whole planet of Arathi plant people who have an entirely different ethos behind their tech and industry, and the two cultures spend the next 100 years in an arms race, leading to a lot of technological melding. My contribution to that cross-pollination is the Thornslinger, an Arathi guerrilla soldier with a cultivated symbiotic gun arm. The challenge here was in making rules for a weapon that is part of the character wielding it, but it's not a natural weapon, Pathfinder's term for the claw or horn of a beast, as that would make the character use monster scaling rules that do not mesh well with firearm rules. I worked with the designer who was in charge of the more general plant symbiont mechanics and came up with what is, in effect, a separate creature that grafts onto the Thornslinger and scales in power with them as they level up, almost like a pet. Unlike the Jump Trooper, in this instance I explicitly wanted the Thorn Gun to be the Thornslinger's single weapon that grows with them over the course of the entire game. The majority of the archetype's abilities revolve around it, so I focused on building a wide array of options for the Thorn Gun to ensure sufficient customization so that it could accommodate many styles of play. The Thorn Gun begins play as a combination of short-range rifle/shotgun, but over the course of the Thornslinger's career, they can cultivate it into a pistol, a sniper rifle, a machine gun, an area denial weapon, or a Frankensteinian combination of all of the above. My only qualm with the design of this archetype comes from our limited playtesting window, which prevented us from testing every possible combination of options, because there's a lot of them on this particular archetype. This resulted in the Thornslinger being very strong compared to many of the other options in the book. It does have probably my favorite piece of art in the whole project, however, and the player response both to the symbiotic plant assassin theme and the plethora of mechanical options was very positive.